You begin with a belief you rarely examine, the assumption that knowledge guarantees truth. You rely on the mind as the final instrument of verification. You assume that when an idea appears coherent, it must be correct, and when a conclusion is reached logically, it must be grounded in reality. But if you pause and observe your thinking with greater care, you notice something unsettling. The mind evaluates truth using standards that the mind itself invented. It verifies claims using tools that it cannot verify. This is the problem Al-Ghazali confronted at the beginning of his inquiry. He realized that the confidence you place in your reasoning is not the product of proof but the result of habit. And when the foundation of certainty rests on habit, how stable can certainty be? Al-Ghazali lived in an age when reason shaped public discourse. Philosophers debated complex systems. Jurists constructed precise doctrines. Theologians defended their conclusions with rigorous argument. Within this environment, rational demonstration appeared to be the highest path to truth. Baghdad, his intellectual home, valued argumentation more than introspection. Yet Al-Ghazali sensed that something essential was missing. The systems around him were coherent but not necessarily grounded in certainty. They explained the structure of ideas but overlooked the reliability of the mind that produced them. The climate encouraged reasoning, but it discouraged questioning the nature of the reasoner. Al-Ghazali's turning point began when he examined the foundations of his own convictions. You may assume that your senses offer reliable information, but he observed that perception is easily deceived. You may trust rational deduction, but he noticed that reasoning depends on premises the mind does not justify. Even philosophical systems fall back on assumptions they cannot test. You begin to see the same pattern. Every form of knowledge relies on an unexamined trust in the very mind that interprets it. When this trust weakens, the entire structure of certainty begins to wobble. Al-Ghazali recognized that without verifying the instrument of knowing, no claim can be fully secured. This realization initiated his crisis, a crisis not of belief, but of verification. You often rely on reason as if it were a neutral and self-sufficient tool. You assume that logical analysis provides direct access to truth. But when you observe thought closely, you see that reasoning operates within boundaries it did not choose. It depends on language, categories, and prior experiences, all of which shape its conclusions. Al-Ghazali saw that reason is strong in analyzing relationships among ideas but weak in explaining the foundation those relationships rest upon. Reason illuminates coherence, not certainty. It can evaluate arguments, but it cannot verify the source of its own authority. Once you recognize this structural limitation, you begin to understand why reasoning alone cannot grant absolute truth. If certainty cannot come solely from the mind's analytical functions, then where does it arise? Al-Ghazali pointed toward the inner faculty he called the heart, not as emotion, but as the center of perception that precedes reasoning. He observed that knowledge appears only when the heart is clear of bias, desire, and self-protection. You notice this as well. When you want an idea to be true, your reasoning rearranges itself around that desire. When you fear an idea, your analysis becomes defensive. In these moments, the heart shapes the outcome long before thought begins. For Al-Ghazali, clarity is not produced by argument but by the purification of the perceiver. When the heart is clouded, even flawless reasoning becomes unreliable. When the heart is clear, truth becomes self-evident before thought articulates it. Doubt, for Al-Ghazali, was not a failure but a discipline. He understood that without questioning the foundations of belief, no belief can become truly grounded. You may think doubt weakens conviction, but he saw the opposite. Doubt exposes what has been merely inherited or repeated, allowing only what can withstand scrutiny to remain. As you apply this inwardly, You begin to see how many of your certainties rest on unexamined assumptions. You may discover that you believed some things simply because they felt familiar. You may find that other beliefs persisted because they supported your identity. Doubt forces the self to loosen its attachment to these patterns. In this way, genuine faith begins not with certainty but with disciplined questioning. You often turn to proof expecting it to reveal truth. But Al-Ghazali observed that proof can also obscure truth when the mind uses it to defend its pre-existing assumptions. You may present arguments not because you have discovered clarity but because you want to maintain stability. Proof becomes a shield rather than a window. You begin to recognize this dynamic within yourself. When you fear the loss of a belief, you assemble arguments in its defense. When you desire an outcome, you construct reasoning to support it. In these moments, proof becomes a tool of self-protection, not discovery. Al-Ghazali identified this subtle distortion as one of the greatest obstacles to certainty. The mind builds a structure of justification around its preferred conclusions, mistaking that structure for truth. The more the mind insists on securing itself through argument, the further it moves from direct perception. The search for proof becomes circular. The mind tries to validate the mind. The result is not clarity but reinforcement of existing patterns. This is why Al-Ghazali concluded that proof, while valuable, cannot be the final authority. When the mind becomes attached to proof, proof becomes a veil. And if proof hides as much as it reveals, what role does it truly play in the pursuit of truth? If neither sense perception nor logical analysis can secure absolute certainty, the inquiry must turn inward. Al-Ghazali realized that the real question is not about the world but about the perceiver. Before asking what is true, you must ask who is seeking truth. When you examine your experience closely, you see that the sense of I influences every conclusion you draw. You interpret ideas in ways that align with your goals, fears, and identity. You want certain things to be true because they support your self-image. You reject others because they threaten it. The self becomes the hidden architect behind your reasoning. Al-Ghazali saw that as long as the self remains unexamined, every conclusion will be shaped by its needs. The search for truth will quietly transform into the search for self-confirmation. The purification of knowledge, therefore, requires the purification of the one who knows. You begin to see that clarity is not a matter of constructing stronger arguments, but of recognizing and suspending the influence of the self. At this point, the inquiry reaches a threshold. Reason has taken you as far as it can. Beyond this point, the obstacle is no longer lack of proof but the interference of the one demanding proof. What happens when you investigate the investigator? Once the self's interference is recognized, another mode of knowing becomes possible. Al-Ghazali described this shift as the emergence of an inner illumination, a direct awareness that does not depend on argument. You may have experienced moments when clarity appears suddenly, before you have constructed any reasoning. These moments do not arise from analysis. They arise when the mind becomes quiet enough for insight to surface. Al-Ghazali saw these insights as a form of knowledge that precedes thought. They require no justification because they are not conclusions, they are recognitions. This is where faith begins. Not as belief without evidence, but as the immediate awareness that appears when reasoning no longer obstructs the truth it seeks. At the end of this inquiry, the mind reaches a point where its effort becomes counterproductive. You begin to see that truth is not an object the mind can possess. It is not something gained through accumulation. It is what remains when the need to secure truth subsides. Al-Ghazali recognized that certainty arises not through conquest but through stillness. When the mind stops grasping, insight appears naturally. Reason is not discarded but placed in its proper position, as a tool, not a foundation. Faith is not a leap beyond logic, but the quiet recognition that knowing does not depend on the one who claims to know. In this silence, the search resolves itself. Nothing is added. Nothing is taken. What remains is clarity without possession. And when the searcher no longer claims the truth no longer hides.